The night over the English Channel was unnaturally calm. Cold air slipped through the gun slit of a concrete bunker perched above Omaha Beach, carrying with it the low hiss of distant surf. Inside, Hinrich Seau ran an oil-soaked cloth down the black steel barrel of his MG-42, the motion steady, ritualistic. This was the weapon on which his fate depended, a mechanical heartbeat that by morning would be pounding at a rhythm no human mind was built to endure. In the breast pocket of his field tunic, folded with the care of something sacred, rested a letter from a girl in Metzingen. "I'll wait until it's over," she'd written. "When we win, we'll build a life together." So had read the words so many times that they had fused with his sense of certainty. To him, and to the men around him, victory wasn't a question, it was a schedule. Only days earlier, a decorated field marshal had stood at this very emplacement, peering through the narrow aperture that framed the beach. His appraisal had been brisk and confident. "If they come here, they'll die here." Those words spread through the ranks like a promise carved in stone. Every inch of the shoreline seemed to confirm it. The Atlantic Wall, Germany's vaunted fortress, rose and coiled across Europe's western coast, stretching from Norway to the Spanish border. Its bunkers squatted on the high ground like clenched fists, thick with concrete and steel. Miles of trenches zigzagged inland, linking gun positions, pillboxes, and command points into a web meant to crush any invading force before it could breathe. Omaha was a masterpiece in this grim architecture. Observation bunkers with interlocking fields of fire stared down at an open beach where rising tides would trap men like ants on a wet table. Czech hedgehogs and Belgian gates were embedded deep in the sand, their sharp iron teeth angled to shred landing craft. Wooden stakes crowned with mines waited just below the high tide line. Beyond that lay fields of explosives, millions of them. The planners had imagined the beach not as a battlefield, but as a cemetery already dug. Behind Seau, a telephone wire hummed faintly in the dark. Somewhere down the line, a junior officer checked watch rotations. Somewhere else, artillery crews joked over cigarettes. They had no reason to think this night was different from the last 1,000. A storm had battered the channel all week, churning waves high and shrouding the coast in cloud. The meteorologists had sworn no invasion could come in weather like this. Senior officers had relaxed, some leaving their posts altogether. Seau tilted his head toward the embrasure. He could see nothing but a horizon, drowned in black. It was the kind of silence that presses against the eardrums. Too still, too perfect. He didn't know it, but that calm was already cracking at its edges. Across the water, unseen in the darkness, ships were forming into an armada that would dwarf every battle he'd ever imagined. He thought of the letter again, and allowed himself the smallest smile. "They'll come, maybe. And if they do, we'll drive them back into the sea." It wasn't bravado. It was belief. The same belief that pulsed through every sandbag, every gun emplacement, every mine buried in the damp earth beneath his boots. In a few hours, that belief would be shredded under a storm of steel. The world would come for this shoreline not as a scattered enemy, but as an ocean of men, machines, and firepower. For now, though, Hinrich Seau simply wiped the last trace of oil from the barrel and set the MG-42 on its rest. Outside, the channel sighed softly against the sand, as if unaware it was about to become history's most violent stage. June 5th had smelled of rain and salt. Gray waves rolled across the channel, their crests torn into spray by an unforgiving wind. High above, thick cloud ceilings pressed down on the coast like a lid. To the German meteorological teams in Paris, the message seemed clear: no fleet could possibly cross in this weather. In an underground briefing room, Luftwaffe forecasters traced storm patterns on grease pencils and issued their verdict. 2 weeks at least, they said. Rain and wind would guard Fortress Europe. Confidence radiated upward through the chain of command like heat from a stove. The generals exhaled. The result was almost invisible at first, a trickle of absent authority. Field Marshal Rommel left the front to celebrate his wife's birthday in Germany, a pair of elegant shoes tucked in his luggage. General Friedrich Dahlmann, commanding the 7th Army, departed for a wargame exercise inland. Naval patrols were reduced or canceled. Batteries went quiet. It wasn't negligence. It was certainty. The Atlantic Wall would hold. The storm had made sure of that. What no one on the German side could see was that the same storm had given the Allies an opening, thousands of miles away, on remote stations in Greenland and aboard long-range weather flights over the Atlantic. Different data told a different story. British meteorologists spotted the faint signature of a gap, a brief, fragile 36-hour window of calmer seas and clearing skies. The information reached Eisenhower at the Supreme Headquarters with the urgency of a match struck in darkness. For days the invasion fleet had waited. An armada hidden by bad weather, thousands of men sealed into landing craft, ships and aircraft like coiled springs. Now came the order. We go. At 23:15 on June 5th, German radar operators began noticing strange patterns on their screens. Dots, bloomed, and faded at the edge of range. The Freya and Würzburg stations reported large aerial formations approaching from the north. But the officers on duty yawned it off. It was a familiar trick, deception raids designed to keep the coast on edge. Minutes turned to hours, reports multiplied. Unusual aircraft formations, flashes on the sea. Something was moving out there. But without senior commanders present, no one acted decisively. Requests for guidance climbed up a chain of command that had already gone to sleep. Behind the calm German lines, the greatest amphibious invasion in history was already in motion. Over 150,000 soldiers, 7,000 ships, and thousands of aircraft rolling forward like a silent tide. Hinrich Seau didn't know any of this. In his bunker, he leaned against the cold wall, eyes half-lidded, listening to the channel's rhythm outside. He had trusted the storm. Everyone had. But storms break, and this one was breaking at precisely the moment the defenders turned their backs. Sometime after midnight, the channel's silence was broken, not by thunder, but by the low hum of engines moving through the night. At first, the sound was faint, more suggestion than noise. But to German radar operators peering at green glow screens in coastal bunkers, the picture was unmistakable. Blips were forming, clusters, waves, patterns too dense to dismiss as mere feints. The reports went up the chain quickly, but like water poured into sand, they disappeared without action. Operators had seen similar signals before, Allied diversion raids, phantom formations meant to exhaust the defenses. They had cried wolf too many times. And tonight, no one wanted to be the fool who sounded the alarm for nothing. Out in the darkness, the sky filled with black shapes. Real paratroopers, thousands of them, drifted down on the wind, their canopies ghostly pale against the clouds. Dummy figures landed beside them in scattered fields, each wired with firecrackers and timed charges. The sound echoed across the Norman countryside like distant skirmishes, amplifying the chaos. By 0:30, telephone lines from multiple sectors began to crackle with contradictory reports. Paratroopers, near Currenton. No, to the east. British units. No, American. Real or dummy? No one could say. Some local units began moving to intercept. Others froze, awaiting confirmation from headquarters that never came. Major Hans von Luck, commander of a Panzergrenadier regiment, was one of the few officers to recognize the pattern immediately. Awakened by urgent calls, he listened to the conflicting reports, then made his own assessment. Paratroopers landing in dispersed formations across both flanks. This wasn't a diversion. This was the opening move of something far larger. He reached for the field telephone and requested permission to counterattack. The answer came back cold, bureaucratic, paralyzing. Do not move until the situation clarifies. Later in his memoirs, von Luck would write, "I knew at that moment we were already lost. Every minute we sat still gave the enemy time to dig in. We were trained to fight, not to wait for permission to breathe." Across Normandy, German officers wrestled with the same dilemma. Command doctrine demanded central approval before movement, but the men authorized to give that approval were either asleep, away, or drowning in confusion. Meanwhile, Allied pathfinders set beacons, marked fields, and cleared drop zones. Paratrooper units began seizing bridges, crossroads, and communication hubs critical to the coming invasion. The longer the defenders hesitated, the more the invisible net closed around them. In his bunker, overlooking the beach, Hinrich Seau was still in darkness, unaware that behind him, the back roads and hedgerows of Normandy were already crawling with enemy soldiers. Somewhere beyond the dunes, parachutes hung in trees like pale flags of an army arriving in silence. For months, the Germans had promised they would meet any invasion at the water's edge. But the invasion had already slipped past them, falling from the sky. The first light of June 6th bled across the channel like a blade cutting through black silk. The sky, moments before a blank curtain, revealed a horizon unlike anything the men of the Atlantic Wall had ever imagined. It started as a thin gray line. Then the line thickened. Then it moved. German forward observers lifted their binoculars, expecting to see the familiar churning of waves against sand. Instead, they saw the sea itself shifting shape. From horizon to horizon, metal filled the water, ships upon ships, row after row, stretching so far into the distance that the line between ocean and sky seemed to disappear. One man at a bunker near Colville reportedly whispered, "That isn't set a fleet, that sets the world." To soldiers raised on years of propaganda about Allied weakness, the sight was paralyzing. For months, they'd been told the enemy would fracture under pressure, that the Americans lacked the will for a real fight. But no nation of cowards could summon this. The fleet was an iron city in motion. 6,939 vessels in all, warships, landing craft, transports, supply ships, from destroyers to small landing barges. Every type of vessel imaginable was out there, advancing like a gray tide. Each silhouette was backlit by the faintest morning glow, making the entire channel shimmer like a living wall of steel. Hinrich Seau leaned forward into the chill morning air, peering through the embrasure of his bunker. His MG-42 rested in its cradle, but his hands were still. For the first time since his posting, the channel did not look empty or calm. It looked alive, and it was coming for him. At 5:35, the stillness cracked. The British battleship Warspite opened fire, her first salvo echoing like a hammer striking the coastline. A moment later, the entire seaward horizon erupted in flashes. Shells screamed overhead, tearing into the cliffs and strongpoints. Observation posts vanished in fountains of concrete dust. Machine gun nests buckled. Trenches disappeared beneath showers of earth. The defenders had trained for bombardment before, but nothing resembled this. The Atlantic Wall was built to withstand enemy artillery, but not the combined fire of a floating nation. Battleships and cruisers hurled shells heavier than trucks into the coastline with methodical precision. One bunker commander would later write, "We did not return fire, we could not even breathe." The sky was screaming. Hinrich's bunker shuddered with every impact. Chunks of plaster fell from the ceiling. A light bulb burst overhead. The sound was so constant, so layered, that it ceased to register as individual explosions. It became something else, like standing beneath a waterfall of metal. For some soldiers, the shock arrived not from what they saw, but from what they felt. They had been promised a fortress that would hold, but concrete cracked like eggshell under the naval barrage. The ground trembled like a living thing. Bunkers built with months of labor and millions of tons of concrete began to peel open in seconds. Above it all, the droning of aircraft built into a rising roar. Thousands of planes filled the morning sky, bombers, fighters, reconnaissance craft, an aerial curtain shielding the invasion fleet. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of German arms, was nowhere. The defenders waited for the promised counterattack from the skies. An artillery officer at WN-62, watching the spectacle, told his men, "This is the whole world arriving on our doorstep." Moments later, his position took a direct hit. What began as a silent horizon had turned into the single most overwhelming sight of the war, a moving continent of steel, fire, and men. The defenders of the Atlantic Wall had believed the invasion would be a fight. What they faced was a tide. At 5:35, when the first thunder rolled ashore, many German soldiers still thought the shelling was temporary, a prelude to some limited raid. By 5:40, that illusion was gone. The bombardment was not a storm. It was a wall of steel falling out of the sky. The battleship Texas hammered Pointe du Hoc with 14-inch shells. Warspite, already in range, delivered its second and third salvos, each one shaking the coastline like an earthquake. Shells fell with such rhythm that they sounded less like war and more like a monstrous machine at work, mechanical, endless, indifferent. The defenders of the Atlantic Wall had been told their fortifications could withstand anything. Bunkers of reinforced concrete, firing ports designed to outlast days of artillery. But as the morning light strengthened, they watched those promises crack open like brittle plaster. At WN-62, the bunker where Hinrich Seau manned his MG-42, the roof trembled with each hit. He pressed his palms against the cold concrete, feeling the bunker shiver like a living thing. A nearby pillbox, once considered invincible, took a direct shell and folded in on itself, swallowing the men inside. The sound didn't echo, it thudded, final. The defenders tried to return fire. Coastal guns spat shells toward the horizon, but their arcs were blind, their targets hidden in the mist and smoke thrown up by the barrage. Each German shot disappeared into the enormity of the invasion fleet like a pebble tossed into the sea. Meanwhile, above the bombardment came the sound of engines. Aircraft, hundreds of them, swarmed the sky in an endless stream. Allied bombers pounded communication nodes, radar stations, and supply points inland. Fighters prowled the skies to make sure no German plane would interfere. At Jagdgeschwader 26, the order came attack with everything. Oberst Joseph Pips Prilla stared at the message and laughed. Everything meant two planes. The Luftwaffe, that had once darkened the skies of Europe, had been ground down to a shadow. Only he and his wingman were able to scramble. Their FFW 190 Sens screamed over the beaches and strafed Sword Sector in a single, desperate pass. It was not a counterattack, it was a gesture. Two angry wasps diving at a hurricane. They banked sharply and fled. No more followed. Back on the ground, the psychological effect was immediate. For months, the defenders had been told that the Luftwaffe would sweep the skies clean. None of them had imagined the enemy could command the air so completely that the sky itself seemed owned. Every minute brought another avalanche of steel. German veterans later described the sensation not as combat, but as burial. Men were entombed in their own fortifications, dug out and buried again as the next wave of shells landed. In some bunkers, ventilation pipes buckled, and the air turned sour and hot. In others, ceiling bolts snapped, and entire firing positions caved in. So could no longer hear individual detonations. The world had turned into one sustained roar that swallowed thought. He moved purely by training, checking his weapon, shifting position, waiting for the next order that never came. The smoke drifted low, clinging to the waterline, like a dirty fog. Through it, vague outlines of landing craft began to emerge, riding the waves toward the beaches. The German guns kept firing, but the sound was dwarfed by the incoming naval fire. The sea itself seemed to be breathing fire. The defenders had been promised a fortress. What they got was a coffin. At 6:30, the first landing craft slammed into the tide. Their metal ramps fell into the surf, and men poured out into the water, rifles held high, boots sinking into wet sand. For the Germans watching from the high ground, it was like watching a swarm advance across an open killing field. Hinrich Seau adjusted the sights of his MG-42 and squeezed the trigger. The weapon barked to life, a brutal, staccato rhythm that echoed down the beach. It wasn't a single gunfight. It was a machine unleashing a curtain of death. Empty brass poured onto the floor of the bunker in glittering streams. Around him, the other guns joined in. Dozens of machine gun nests and mortar positions spat fire into the gray morning. The first wave of American infantry faltered under the withering barrage. Many never reached the sandbar. Others clawed forward through smoke, water, and bodies, dragging themselves toward obstacles that bristled with explosives. For the defenders, these early minutes felt like vindication. This was how they had imagined it. Waves of attackers cut down before they could reach the shore. Seau's barrel glowed red as he fired burst after burst, methodically sweeping the shoreline. He had been told that their firepower could erase any assault, and in these first few moments, it almost seemed true. But the sound never stopped. For every man who fell, more came behind him. Landing craft touched the sand one after another, like conveyor belts feeding an endless machine. Destroyers in the bay edged dangerously close to the coast, their guns hurling shells with terrifying precision at the strong points. One German position after another disappeared in showers of sand and smoke. Seau kept firing. By 9 o'clock he had gone through thousands of rounds. By noon, the floor of his bunker was ankle-deep in casings. At some point, his assistant gunner burned his hands swapping barrels. The MG-42 was designed to spit 1,200 rounds a minute, unstoppable in short bursts, punishing when pushed to its limit. This wasn't the clean, controlled defense the Atlantic Wall had been built for. It was survival. Ammunition carriers ran crouched between craters, runners brought panicked reports, mortar crews were gone. Artillery behind the beaches had gone silent or been annihilated. Command lines flickered in and out like dying signals. And still the Allies came. Every lost machine gun nest was immediately met with naval gunfire, smokescreens, and new landing craft. The German firepower, which had once seemed infinite, was a matchstick burning in a hurricane. Historians would later call this material shock, the moment when defenders realized that no matter how well they fought, they were outnumbered, outgunned, and outproduced. Hinrich Seau wasn't thinking of history. He was fighting not to drown in noise. Every sense was overloaded. The roar of the gun, the scream of shells, the rising cries from the beach below, the MG's barrel warped from heat. The bunker's walls trembled. The men who survived did so because they were shielded by concrete and luck. By midday, the defenders were running out of everything: ammunition, men, and certainty. The defensive fire plans had assumed they could fight for days, but they were burning through their resources in hours. Down on the beaches, American engineers blew paths through the obstacles with Bangalore torpedoes. Sherman tanks, some amphibious, some ferried ashore, began clawing their way up the sand. For Seau, the moment that broke him wasn't a shell or a bullet. It was looking down through the gun sight and realizing that no matter how many targets he hit, they were still coming. The invasion didn't pause. It didn't flinch. It advanced like a machine with infinite fuel. By late afternoon, Seau's position was one of the few still firing. The others were gone, crushed, buried, or silent. He stared through smoke-stung eyes at a beach covered with wreckage, and understood without anyone saying it that this wasn't just a battle, it was a flood. The defenders had been trained to kill the landing, but the landing was bigger than anything they could kill. By early afternoon on June 6th, the Atlantic Wall was still standing in places, but it was no longer fighting as a wall. It was bleeding from 100 points at once. The bunkers along Omaha Beach had not fallen in a single dramatic collapse. They were being pried apart like a seam splitting under constant strain. The fire that had felt unstoppable at dawn was now a ragged chorus of isolated guns, each fighting its own private war. The German defense plans had calculated everything: angles of fire, interlocking fields, exact ammunition expenditure for a 3-day engagement. But those calculations assumed a contained landing, a manageable enemy. Nobody had planned for a war machine that simply refused to stop coming. By 13 o'clock, many positions were reporting critical ammunition shortages. Mortar crews rationed their last shells. Machine gunners counted every belt. Artillery batteries further inland tried to send what they could forward, but every road and bridge was under constant Allied air attack. Convoys burned before they reached the coast. Up the chain of command, radio operators shouted into static. Allied electronic jamming fractured communications. Telephone cables lay in ditches, cut by both bombardment and French resistance saboteurs. What had once been a carefully synchronized defensive network had devolved into a collection of disconnected outposts, each receiving nothing but silence when they called for help. The armored reserves that were supposed to counterattack immediately after the landing were nowhere near the beaches. The 21st Panzer Division, Germany's only real armored force in the sector, waited for authorization that came hours too late. Commanders hesitated, frozen between conflicting orders and unclear intelligence. When the order finally arrived, the division rolled out into a landscape already transformed. Bridges were destroyed, crossroads seized, and Allied paratroopers were dug in behind the lines. The Germans had planned to fight at the water's edge. Instead, they found the enemy scattered across their rear like seeds in a plowed field. Heinz von Luck's grenadiers pushed forward through villages, lit only by burning farmhouses. Overhead, the nightmarish reality of Allied air supremacy pressed down on them. Every column that moved was spotted. Every spotted column was bombed. They advanced not like attackers, but like men moving under the barrel of a gun too big to fight back against. For the men in the bunkers, this distant failure crept in as silence. No tanks appeared on the horizon. No counterattack formed. Reinforcements didn't arrive. The men who had once believed they were part of an unbreakable machine were realizing they were alone. Hinrich Seau, his MG-40, too scorched and rattling, glanced at the runner who stumbled into the bunker with the last ammunition belt. There would be no more after this. Around 1620, the 21st Panzer Division finally made contact with the coast. But instead of driving the Allies back, they ran headfirst into a sky full of gliders. Operation Mallard, British reinforcements arriving in waves. To the German tankers, it must have felt like a cruel trick. Every time they moved, the enemy doubled. The myth of the Atlantic Wall hadn't shattered in one decisive blow, it was breaking apart in slow motion. Each hour peeling away another layer of the illusion. The defenders had thought of themselves as the shield of Europe. Now they were fragments, holding on to positions that no longer mattered in a battle already slipping beyond their reach. As night fell on June 6th, the battlefield no longer looked like an invasion. It looked like construction. The beach that had been an inferno of fire and screaming hours earlier was now a machine in motion. Landing craft continued to arrive in tight, steady intervals. Trucks rolled down makeshift ramps, bulldozers shoved wreckage aside. Temporary piers sprouted from the shoreline like steel ribs. By the time most German defenders were counting their last rounds, the Allies were already laying the bones of a permanent beachhead. The difference wasn't just in numbers, it was in rhythm. German logistics were built on rigid timetables and vulnerable lines of supply that snaked through occupied France. Allied logistics moved like a factory, predictable, automated, relentless. Within hours, more than 100,000 men, Thousands of vehicles and endless stockpiles of ammunition had crossed the channel. Meanwhile, German reinforcements sat far from the battlefield, moving at a crawl. Every road was a trap. Allied fighter bombers turned highways into burning scrapyards. Trains were ambushed before they reached rail junctions. Bridges vanished beneath bombs. It didn't matter how brave or disciplined the units were if they never arrived intact. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, once the pride of the German Armored Corps, began its march from the south of France, a journey that should have taken 3 days. It took 17. By the time it neared Normandy, a third of its vehicles were gone, destroyed by air power before they had even seen the enemy. To the defenders in the bunkers, this imbalance became a quiet horror. Reinforcements weren't coming because they couldn't. Supplies weren't arriving because they were ash on the side of the road. The Allied war machine wasn't just winning battles, it was denying the Germans the ability to fight them. And the machine didn't sleep. By June 12th, the Mulberry Harbor's massive artificial ports floated across the channel in pieces were being assembled with methodical precision. By then, the Allies were landing 15,000 tons of supplies a day, more than the German forces in Normandy consumed in a week. Hinrich Seau, numb from days without rest, watched the beach through a cracked firing port. The sea, once empty, now swarmed with ships moving in neat, efficient lines. Everything had a place. Everything had a function. The enemy wasn't fighting with desperation. They were building with confidence. Across the countryside, German units stumbled through ruined roads, dodging aircraft they could never hope to match. Luftwaffe support had become a memory. Crews rationed shells like gold. Men marched on empty stomachs. The contrast was total. Allied soldiers stepped ashore with fresh gear, hot food, ammunition stacked like cordwood, and armor arriving behind them. German soldiers fought in worn boots, carrying the same dwindling crates of ammunition they had started with. What the defenders of the Atlantic Wall were witnessing wasn't just an invasion, it was the industrial revolution of warfare. One side was fighting a battle, the other side was manufacturing victory in real time. By the middle of June, the front lines were no longer defined by concrete bunkers. They were being redrawn by ships, cranes, trucks, and supply chains. Germany's defenses were still full of soldiers who could fight. What they lacked was everything else. By the second week of June, the German command in Normandy no longer resembled an army. It resembled a scattered collection of voices shouting into the void. Radio networks once designed to coordinate thousands of men now returned only static. Allied jamming hummed like a dull saw, cutting through frequencies and severing units from their headquarters. Field telephones lay in muddy ditches, their lines shredded by artillery or cut by resistance fighters who seemed to know exactly where to strike. General Max Pemsel at 7th Army Headquarters tried to stitch the battlefield together through fragments of reports that arrived hours late. In one direction, a division had simply vanished from the map. In another, an armored battalion reported advancing only for its message to be the last anyone heard from it. Units were fighting, retreating, or dying in silence. Meanwhile, Allied communications were crisp, layered, and redundant. Radar, encrypted radios, naval spotters, and airborne observers created a seamless picture of the battlefield. German officers were blind men trying to fight an enemy with perfect vision. Orders from above became meaningless. Commands issued in the morning were obsolete by the time they reached the front, if they ever did, isolated strongpoints. Once part of a vast defensive web, were reduced to small pockets acting on instinct. Some units fought stubbornly. Others withdrew without a word. A few surrendered outright when they realized there was no one left to report to. Hinrich Seau no longer listened for orders. There were none. His bunker had become a silent island in a war that was moving on without it. The runners who once carried messages had stopped coming. The field phone was dead. He and the men around him fired at shapes they could barely see, guided not by strategy but by the simple reflex of staying alive. In some sectors, German officers attempted counterattacks in the dark. Without coordination, they marched straight into prepared artillery and naval gunfire. Allied flares turned the night into daylight. Every road they tried was already mapped, every column targeted before it could form. The paralysis extended to the highest levels. Panzer divisions remained bottled up by conflicting orders from Berlin, where Hitler still imagined the Atlantic Wall holding firm. His insistence on defending every position to the last man turned flexibility into suicide. Meanwhile, Eisenhower's staff adjusted plans hourly, moving reserves with speed the Germans couldn't match even on their best days. What the Germans experienced as chaos, the Allies experienced as control. Inside command bunkers, maps became obsolete faster than officers could replace the pins. Counterattacks were planned against positions that no longer existed. Reinforcements were ordered to move down roads that had already been turned into craters. This was no longer a battle of armies maneuvering against each other. It was one army maneuvering against itself and another directing the flow of history. By mid-June, the German defensive network that had been built over years had unraveled in a matter of days. The myth of the Atlantic Wall wasn't just a line on the map that had been breached, it was a structure of command, faith, and certainty. And that structure was collapsing from the inside out. In the dead of night, June 7th bled into June 8th, not with silence, but with the low mechanical hum of an invasion settling into permanence. Allied ships came and went like a tide that could not be stopped. Landing craft scraped against the sand with clockwork precision. Every hour, more men and machines arrived. Every hour, the German perimeter shrank a little more. The counterattacks the Germans had promised themselves never came, not in any meaningful way. Armored units sent to smash the beachhead never struck as a single hammer. They dribbled into combat, fragmented, caught between Allied air power and paratroopers already dug in behind the lines. Heinz von Luck's grenadiers, advancing toward Sword Beach under cover of darkness, were lit up by parachute flares that hung in the sky like pale moons. Allied naval guns found them in seconds. One officer later said it was like walking into daylight and finding God aiming the guns himself. Half the unit was gone before they saw a single enemy face. The French resistance, dormant for months, now moved like a blade behind the front. Bridges vanished in explosions. Telephone lines stayed down no matter how many times they were repaired. Supply trains derailed in the night. In some villages, resistance fighters passed Allied intelligence real-time positions of German movements. It wasn't just the front collapsing, it was the rear rotting away. By June 9th, Allied engineers had transformed chaos into order. Roads were cleared, supply dumps organized. Tank columns were already pushing inland. Each beachhead wasn't just holding, it was expanding like a living organism. German officers clung to the idea that their defense might stabilize if they could just hold one strong point. But as they shifted men from one crisis to another, they discovered there was no stable ground left. Every strong point was just another island, waiting to be cut off and drowned. Hinrich Seau's bunker at WN62 had once felt like the center of the world. Now it felt like the edge of it. He could see nothing but smoke, fire, and silhouettes of advancing men. His ammunition was low. His field of fire was shrinking. The sky belonged to the enemy. The land belonged to the enemy. The sea was nothing but enemy. What made it worse was the quiet precision of it all. The Allied advance wasn't a chaotic charge. It was methodical. Naval gunfire bracketed targets with perfect accuracy. Artillery struck with mathematical rhythm. Armored columns advanced behind curtains of smoke, their pace steady, confident, unstoppable. The German army had fought enemies before, on the Eastern Front in North Africa, but never an enemy that seemed less like an army and more like a system that never tired, never ran out of shells, and never stopped moving forward. By June 10th, German commanders knew what the rank and file had sensed for days. The trap was closing. With the skies controlled, the sea owned, and the countryside crawling with resistance, their war in Normandy was becoming less a battle and more a slow constriction. The noose was not tightening with a single decisive blow. It was tightening, hour by hour, mile by mile, until the space to fight disappeared entirely. By mid-June, the German front line at Normandy had stopped behaving like a wall and started behaving like a dying organism. It twitched, it resisted, but every motion was slower, weaker, and more desperate than the last. Ammunition that was meant to last 3 days had been spent in the first hours of the landings. What was left came in drips, sporadic truckloads that were as likely to be strafed into flaming wrecks on the road as they were to arrive intact. Artillery batteries rationed shells to a handful per gun per day. Machine gun positions fought until barrels warped and hands blistered. Men learned to count their bullets not in magazines, but in individual rounds. At WN-62, Hinrich Seau had long since lost track of how many belts he had fed into the MG-42. The weapon that had once roared like a storm now coughed through its last ammunition boxes. When it went quiet, the silence felt louder than the battle itself. Around him, the beach he was supposed to hold looked like a different world, a shoreline swallowed by Allied steel. Reinforcements never came. Everyone on the front knew why. The roads were under Allied air control. Every convoy was a target. Every tank was a smoking crater before it reached the fight. Panzer divisions that were meant to punch through to the beaches were bleeding themselves dry on the roads miles away. Command posts spoke of holding fast, but these were empty words carried on broken radios. Units didn't maneuver anymore. They simply tried to survive where they stood. If they fell back, they did so without orders. If they held, it was because they had nowhere else to go. The men in the bunkers were no longer soldiers in a traditional sense. They were stranded fragments of a broken plan. They no longer believed in Rommel's promises of throwing the Allies back into the sea. They had seen too much steel, too many ships, too many planes. What they felt now was the weight of being on the wrong side of history. Across the beaches, the Allies did not slow down. The flow of men and machines increased with mechanical certainty. Every day, more cranes, trucks, and tanks rolled ashore. Every hour, naval artillery pulverized positions that hadn't already been wiped off the map. German strongpoints that had once taken years to build disappeared in minutes beneath high explosive shells. What little remained of German air power was irrelevant. A single Luftwaffe strafing run had been reduced to legend simply because it was the only one. The sky belonged to the enemy, and with it, so did the future. By June 15th, the front line was no longer a line. It was a series of disconnected outposts, each isolated, each fighting its own small war, none of them truly believing they could win. Messages took hours to travel miles. If they arrived at all, ammunition dumps were gone. Vehicles were abandoned for lack of fuel. Entire units disappeared, not because they were annihilated in battle, but because they dissolved into the countryside, cut off and forgotten. The collapse wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. It was slow, grinding, inevitable. Like a structure that had been hollowed out long before the first shell hit it. Hinrich Seau watched the endless columns of Allied troops on the horizon and understood what every German soldier in Normandy eventually learned. The battle was no longer theirs to win. It was only theirs to survive.